Now, here's a question that might be of interest to our guest of the day. I hope it is. How big is the Conservative Party? The party hasn't revealed how many paid-up members it has since 2013, or hasn't wanted to, but estimates suggest the total may have fallen since then and is below 100,000. Now, size isn't everything, as they say, but does the health of the party's grassroots matter? Our Ellie has been finding out what members themselves think.
Can you believe it's 6 months since the general election? Well, even the party that won it have had to spend time licking their wounds, drowning their sorrows, working out what went wrong. So what might the Tories do differently if and when there's another general election? Thank you. Happily, I've got some people here to find out. Hello, chaps. Right, whose were the orange juices? Ben Howlett lost his seat in Bath in June. 31 now, he was one of the Tories' youngest MPs. He's brought some of his Conservative chums, all members, to have a chat. OK, so Ben, why did you lose your seat?
I think the main reason why I lost the seat was because of the Brexit vote. It was 70% Remain in the constituency, so putting out a message of strengthening my hand in the negotiations that the Prime Minister put out went well at the beginning, but then social care changes, etc. happened and things fell apart quite quickly after that.
The Conservatives just suffer with this brand issue, don't they? They're just not cool.
I see more young activists around when we go to party conference, when I, in my own local area, when I'm attending regional events in London or Yorkshire, when we go out campaigning. I think it's necessarily, we're not shouting about it. We're not really concerned about necessarily promoting the brand of youth.
So do you think the leadership listens to the membership?
Certainly starting out, I did feel a little bit like I was just someone who was just going to deliver or knock on doors, and even though that's the bread and butter of a party campaign machine, I felt like that didn't really matter because that was just assumed you would do. You know, even to the point where sometimes there would be kind of meals and things in a local association and I wouldn't be invited because I hadn't apparently campaigned enough. And I thought, well, actually, that's not the way to actually get me to campaign more.
I think one of the things that MPs can do in particular, though, is start to engage with their members more, because as an MP, you're stuck in Westminster 4 days a week, and you don't have that to and fro with your members as much as you do as when you're a candidate. If MPs can do more to listen to their members by thinking about some of the new policies, such as I did in Bath, then that's a really great way to start changing the way that we think about different issues. And you probably get a lot more members in as a result.
And what do you think, Ben?
I mean, I think there's always more that any political party can do. I find our access to ministers, our influence on policy doesn't always lead to the results we want, but I do feel that we're listened to.
The new generation are more active. Again, but we have figures such as James Cleverly, Brandon Lewis, the new chairman, and a few other MPs who, because they came up through the grassroots, and a lot of them were young at the time, again, Ben Howlett was one of them, they listen more to the local association, local members and regional, so we actually have more activities now on a regional and local basis than before.
OK, so you're all painting quite a positive picture. How positive are you about the next general election, if and when it is?
I think we're getting there now. Policy-wise, completely agree with Ben. Also not forgetting now, Michael Gove's come in and really reforms the way we approach animal welfare and environmental issues, which was always a bit of a strain for me as someone who's a proud Tory member and activist. It was always the part of me that always struggled every time we came to vote. I'd always vote Conservative, but there was almost a bit of a heavy heart there because animal welfare and the environment has always been very important to me.
Well, we can speak now to Professor Tim Bale, who has recently published research into the state of Britain's political parties. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Tim, what is the relative health of the Conservative Party compared to other political parties?
Well, it's certainly not growing as much as other political parties. Labour has undergone this phenomenal growth since Jeremy Corbyn took over, and the Conservatives have either stayed still or probably shrunk, to be honest. I've heard some reports that maybe they're down to 70,000, which would make them smaller, in fact, than the Liberal Democrats and indeed the SNP. I certainly wouldn't put them above 100,000, and the Conservative Party's been notably reluctant to release membership figures for the last 3 or 4 years, which indicates that, in fact, they are in trouble in that respect.
Yes, we've clocked the fact that they've been reluctant to do that. How important, in your mind, is a healthy grassroots to winning elections?
Well, I think the evidence suggests that in a very close race in a constituency, the effort on the ground that parties can make does make a difference. And we're talking there about canvassing in particular, identifying voters and then knocking them up in order to vote. We're also talking about delivering leaflets, but also increasingly we have to say that elections are being fought online, and that's where the Conservatives have got a particular problem. Partly because of the age structure of the Conservative Party. Conservative Party members just don't seem, from our research anyway, to do anywhere near as much on, say, Facebook and on Twitter and on other forms of social media than members of other parties.
Right, so social media is obviously critically important in future elections. In your mind, how reflective are the attitudes of Tory members, of Tory voters, and the voters that they actually need to gain to win?
Well, it's important that you separate those two groups, because I don't think that Conservative Party members are that far away from people who, if you like, are core Conservative Party voters. But where they are quite far away from is the sort of voter that the Conservative needs to pick up at the next election and indeed in elections to come. You look at Conservative Party's members' attitudes and they are pretty authoritarian, they're not very liberal, they're pretty traditional. And as of course, as Britain becomes rather more socially liberal over time, in part because so many more people are going to university now, that could be a problem for the Conservative Party going forward.
Do Conservative members have less say in the direction of their party than other parties, particularly now?
Absolutely. I mean, the only rights really that being a Conservative Party member gives you is the right to select parliamentary candidates in your constituency and occasionally, if there is a leadership contest, to vote in that. You have no say whatsoever, at least formally, in terms of policy. That's certainly not the case in other parties. The Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and of course the Green Party all give their members a significant say. And I think that does have something to do with the fact that Conservative Party members do feel rather less appreciated, if you like, by their leadership.
Tim Bale, thank you very much. Graham Brady, since I've asked every Conservative that's been on this programme this week, how many members does the Conservative Party have?
I don't know. And
you don't want to know, though, do you?
No, I'd be very happy to know. The simple fact is we don't have a central membership register, and so it's quite difficult to have an accurate figure. I think at the time of the leadership election, it was something around, I think it was certainly over 100,000, something like 120,000, not nearly as high as it should be. But there was also a very interesting question that you asked Tim Bale when you said, is a healthy grassroots important for electoral success? Yes, I think it is, but the converse of that, an unhealthy grassroots can be really quite damaging as well. And one of the concerns, I think, looking at the Labour Party and the big growth in Momentum membership, you've got this big block of hard left-wing people who now make it very, very difficult to see how the Labour Party becomes a sort of centre ground electable proposition.
Well, except they did much better than was expected and they did get an enormously high share of the vote, admittedly like the Conservative Party. If you don't think the health of the grassroots really matters, let's say the figures have dropped below 100,000, which is pretty well what everyone is saying, is that a worry?
I want to see much stronger party membership. I'd like to see us being more open to the membership. I'd like to see the party conference being more of a genuine debate again and less about broadcast and a little bit more received from the members too. So yes, I'm very keen on expanding the membership. I think for a long time there was
and giving them more power.
I think, well, there's certainly more of a voice, and I think it's important that political parties do listen to their members.
Except, Tim Bale says they don't really reflect Tory voters in the country at large. Do you agree with that?
He said they reflect Tory voters rather well.
No, the core Tory voters, but not the ones that they need to gain to actually win a majority in an election.
We possibly need to look different at some of the people we need to reach out to. I think it also depends very much where you are. You know, my own membership in Altrincham and Sale is still pretty strong, pretty much the same figure that it's been for a number of years. I would love to see that double.
Right, well, it's all about how you do it. Do you think the beefing up of Conservative headquarters, which was done in the recent reshuffle, the appointment of 13 vice chairs and a new chairman in Brandon Lewis, is that going to make a big difference?
Well, I'm less concerned about the number of vice chairs and more concerned about the quality of them. I think we've got some fantastic people involved who will be driving some of this process. And, you know, obviously Brandon Lewis is the new party chairman. I've got a lot of faith in him. James Cleverly is the deputy who was picked out in the piece that you've just shown. A very old friend of mine, Kemi Badenoch. I think she's very, very good news as well. So we've got a lot of real quality coming in there and a lot of people with a lot of enthusiasm and drive to make things work.
And would a better operation at CCHQ have made a difference at last year's election, which you said everything went wrong?
I think that pretty much everything did go wrong. Part of that was not just the period of the election, it was a period of lack of preparation in advance of that, because no election was anticipated. And particularly Tim Bale's point about social media and the ability to communicate as widely as we need to in that way, that had been allowed to atrophy for the previous couple of years, and now there is a real focus on getting that right.
What about the reshuffle in general? Were you satisfied with that? Do you think it could have been more radical?
Well, it certainly could have been more radical. I was sort of reflecting on what word I would settle on for the reshuffle.
And what is it?
I had an inkling you might ask me about it. I think oversold is probably the word. I think if this reshuffle had just happened and people were looking at it by its own merits, people would say it was a pretty reasonable reshuffle. There were some very good, strong moves, some good new people coming into government, some sensible changes, David Liddington replacing the coordination role that Damien Green was doing before, for instance. My own favourite, and it might not have been what the Prime Minister had in mind, but my own favourite highlight of the reshuffle was actually Jeremy Hunt so determined to remain at the helm of the National Health Service.
And did that demonstrate her weakness rather than her strength?
I would say actually it demonstrates something really important, which is that Jeremy has been so committed to the NHS and to getting it right, and really cares about that, and his determination to stand by it until he's got there.
What does it say about the Prime Minister, who wanted to move him?
That she was prepared to be persuaded by him, that he was sufficiently committed and determined to get that right.
Are you pleased that the woman who stood in the way of grammar school expansion has gone?
No, and I like Justine Greening, and she's a friend and a colleague. I'm not pleased when any of my colleagues find themselves out of office when they wanted to be in office. I'm also, though, pleased to see Damien Hinds in that job. As it happens, he's a grammar school boy from Altrincham, St Ambrose College.
So are you hoping then that policy will be reversed? And that there'll be further expansion?
There's been a reverse in the policy. I hope to see some steady progress being made on the question of giving parents more choice of schools, and that should include the ability to choose selective schools where they want to.
Right. I mean, Nick Timothy, former advisor to Theresa May, who went obviously after the election, thought it was right for Justine Greening, the former Education Secretary, to go because she apparently blocked tuition fee cuts. Do you think that would be right in terms of getting rid of someone that was blocking reform? I've no idea whether that was the case. I don't know what discussions had happened within government on tuition fees. Right. I mean, this article in the Telegraph today suggests that Nick Timothy still speaks to the Prime Minister, and he was, along with Fiona Hill, blamed in some part for that election campaign. If that is so, is it appropriate that the Prime Minister is still in such close conversation with her former advisers? I think the Prime Minister can talk to as many friends and colleagues and advisers as she wishes. I think the more people she talks to, the better. Are you disappointed that there isn't going to be a Minister for No Deal attending Cabinet? No, I don't think that's necessary. I think what we have seen is a strengthening of the DEXU department with another minister, Suella Fernandez, one of the very capable, very strong new members coming into the government, and I think that would be a real asset. Right. Would you have liked to have seen somebody representing that particular option? It was felt that it should be explored more fully by Brexiteers. I'm not particularly keen on the idea of having ministers with a kind of particular policy agenda that they're responsible for. They're responsible for delivering the government's policy. The government's policy is very straightforward, very clear, and we are making progress towards it, very significant progress just before Christmas. I think there's a lot of optimism now that we'll move forward with phase 2 in a more constructive way with our EU partners. Now, Michael Gove has told Conservative Home that he fancies Damien Hinds, whom you've just talked about, the new Education Secretary, and Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, for next Tory leader. Do you agree with him? Well, you see, while I'm chairman of the 1922 committee, I would be returning officer in any contest that might ever happen. I really couldn't express a preference, but I'll say they're both very good people. And in a way, I think looking at the reshuffle, looking especially perhaps at some of the new members of the government, I think we are in a very strong position for the future. We've got so much talent on the Conservative benches in the House of Commons, and that is a really positive sign for the future of the Conservative Party and of the country. What about the talent at the top? Last time you were here in this studio, you said to me that Theresa May was safe in post at the moment. Yeah. Is that still your view? Well, that is always, I think I probably also said at the time, that's all any Prime Minister or leader of any party is at any time. And do you see her fighting the next election as leader of the Conservative Party? What I said about that, and my
position remains the same, is that it is the view of my colleagues that we don't want to see a leadership election, that they're behind the Prime Minister, they think we're making good progress, and whilst lots of people may say at the moment, Theresa May may not lead the Conservative Party through the next general election. That isn't a judgment that's going to be taken today. It's a judgment that will be taken in 2 or 3 years' time. And I think the whole landscape might look very different then as we are emerging from the negotiations and the agreement on Brexit.
So by March 2019, there could be a leadership contest?
Well, of course there could be.
Yes.
My view is that a successful exit from the European Union, Britain continuing to see strong economic growth, low unemployment, record levels of inward investment as we're seeing at the moment, it's quite likely people will look at the Prime Minister and say, hey, she's done a pretty good job.
And might be able to stay. What about Michael Gove's prospects? Could you see him as a future leader of the Conservative Party?
As I said, I'm not going to comment on who should be a future leader of the Conservative Party, but I think Michael Gove is doing a brilliant job at DEFRA, and I'm very, very pleased to see the measures taken to get rid of microbeads. Very pleased with what he's saying today about plastics.
All right. Now, the former Lib Dem leader and committed